America fighting for freedom was the rhetoric of World War II. Ironically, at the same time, the U.S. was compromising the freedom of its own citizens. At the time that European citizens were being imprisoned based solely on their ethnicity, on the west coast of the United States, the U.S. military was doing the same thing. The Korematsu case arose during World War II. Wars are generally not good times for judicial protection of minority rights. The country is often wound up in a frenzy where any differences are suspect, and courts seldom escape wartime hysteria. The background to this case starts with Japanese immigration to the U.S. in the 19th and early 20th century. Through hard work, many of these immigrants and their children became comfortably middle class. They were successful farmers, small business people, and the like. And this led to a great resentment towards them on the part of some whites, particularly farmers. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th of 1941, and the U.S. declared war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy. In the early days of the war, there was great fear of sabotage and attack. In Britain, for example, there were 74,000 German and Austrian citizens when the war broke out. Britain has no written constitution, and its courts lack the power of judicial review. However, the British gave every suspected person an individual hearing over a 6-month period. Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor is based, has approximately 32% of its population of Japanese descent. There, any arrests for potential sabotage or espionage were based on individualized suspicion with full due process guarantees. Things were different on the U.S. mainland. On the U.S. West Coast, there were approximately 112,000 persons of Japanese descent, a touch over 1% of the population. 70,000 of them were American citizens, and 43% were either over 50 or under age 15. Now, as part of the war effort, in 1942, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that divided the U.S. into military areas. The Congress followed this up with legislation substantially embodying that order. A general named DeWitt was put in charge of the Western Defense Command, and he put the entire Pacific Coast area in a special category. First, he issued a nighttime curfew for German and Italian citizens and all persons of Japanese ancestry living in coastal areas. Then, on May 3rd of 1942, he issued an order for all persons of Japanese ancestry to leave the area. Although German and Italian citizens living on the West Coast were allowed to remain and go about their normal lives, all persons of Japanese ancestry, including 70,000 U.S. citizens, were ordered to report to what were called civilian control stations. They were then shipped to what the government labeled relocation centers. These relocation centers were located in isolated, mostly desert settings. They consisted of primitive shacks surrounded by barbed wire with watchtowers and patrolled by armed guards. Gene Rostow, writing in 1945, described them this way. He wrote, "The camps were in fact concentration camps, where the humiliation of evacuation was compounded by a regime which ignored citizens' rights." What was the evidence for sending these American citizens of Japanese ancestry to the camps? There wasn't any. There were no charges of espionage or sabotage. There were no trials. People were forced to leave their homes, their businesses, their possessions, their friends. Their goods were sold at fireside prices to whites. By the time of the decision to send American citizens of Japanese descent to the camps, not one person of Japanese ancestry had been accused or convicted of espionage or sabotage. Now, Fred Korematsu was an American citizen of Japanese ancestry living in California. To be with his girlfriend, he decided to disobey the order to go to the camps, and he stayed in California. He was arrested and convicted of illegally remaining in a military control area. Korematsu challenged this conviction under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. He argued, in essence, that he was being punished without a hearing and was unfairly targeted because of his race. However, by a vote of 6-3, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Justice Black wrote the decision, and he started in a way that was hopeful for Korematsu. He stated that all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect, and he added that courts must subject them to the most rigid scrutiny. However, he then deferred to the military, accepting the governmental judgment that some members of the population might be disloyal and could not be dealt with safely. Justice Black stressed that this case couldn't be decided without what he called reference to the real military dangers which were presented. Well, what about the hardships that Japanese Americans faced? Black was dismissive. He wrote, "Hardships are a part of war, and war is an aggregation of hardships." Finally, he denied that there was any racism involved. There were three powerful dissenting opinions written by Justices Roberts, Murphy, and Jackson. Justice Murphy, for example, called the military order an obvious racial discrimination which deprives Americans of Japanese descent of all their constitutional rights to procedural due process. He dissented from what he called this legalization of racism.